My theme today is emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence as a piece of literature and research is no more than 30 years old. Some bits of this in its primary form have been available earlier. In the last 10 years, the research around emotional intelligence has become so rigorous, and that capability is so critical to future and sustainable success of leaders that even the World Economic Forum listed it as amongst the top 10 critical capabilities that leaders must have for the 21st century. Although the research around emotional intelligence is about 3 decades old, emotional intelligence as a phenomenon is as old as mankind. If you look at the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, these are tales and stories and epics and narratives of people who either possessed or lacked emotional intelligence. If you were to scan through the narrative using the emotional intelligence binocular, you will find it fascinating. And you will find many of the contemporary models of emotional intelligence reasonably inadequate in the way they capture that reality. I am here to tell you that an indigenous perspective on emotional intelligence is most critical. We must look at what Daniel Goleman has done, what Cooper and Savoff have done, what the MHS people have done with the EQI, what the Hay Group has done, and they have done good work. But we must also use that as a thinking tool to expand our own way of exploring what comprises the Indian reality, what comprises indigenous management and leadership challenges. And the purpose of emotional intelligence, therefore, is to decipher in the context of India what its relevance is. Let me give you one example. Very central to the idea of emotional intelligence is the idea of happiness, well-being. If you were to put well-being or happiness on the x-axis and productivity on the y-axis and map it as low, low and high, high, you will get a 2x2 quadrant. If you're low on happiness and low on productivity, isn't that the definition of living hell? If you're high on productivity and low on happiness, you're headed to burnout. If you're high on happiness and low on productivity, it is just not sustainable. Therefore, the only relevant pursuit is high happiness and high productivity. High happiness and high productivity with a caveat, happiness first. How to be happy? What comprises the dimensions of happiness? Many of these thinkers have some frameworks and tools, and I find them somewhat inadequate. If you were to go back into the idea of happiness given India's own wisdom traditions, you would find a very enriching component. Take, for example, the Panchamaya Kosha as described in the Bhriguvali of the Taittiriya Upanishad. There's the Annamaya Kosha, the Pranamaya Kosha, Manomaya Kosha, Vijnanamaya and Anandamaya Kosha. Ananda then is the quintessential idea of happiness. What happens at the bodily level? What happens at the level of vitality and energy? What happens at the level of emotional makeup and stability? What happens at the level of intellectual perspective and integratedness? When these are aligned, happiness is a consequence. I am not saying I have spoken adequately about the Panchamaya Kosha, only an example of how much richness exists on this side of the world to pursue the idea of emotional intelligence and using the binocular of emotional intelligence to scan India's wisdom traditions and benefit from it directly for yourself as well as for others, those that come in contact with you. I'm very delighted to be part of this forum, and I'm delighted to be part of this idea of exploring emotional intelligence. I think it's an incredibly important one, especially at the turn of the century, especially in the context of COVID and post-COVID world. Welcome to emotional intelligence. Thank you, and I look forward.